Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for May 4th, 2022. Today I'm going to discuss the question of what can be done to end the war in Ukraine. There was a 2-hour talk yesterday between French President Macron and Russian President Putin where they took up this subject. And we have a report from the Russians on it, although very little so far from the French. The question is, was Macron listening to Putin when he made his suggestions on how to end the war? To get the background on this, you have to look at the completely wild response now coming from Ukraine's leaders. It's as though they're pumped up on adrenaline from the Western stories about how they're defeating the Russian army and how great they are. The leaders are echoing the most unhinged war hawks in the West, such as the United Kingdom's Boris Johnson and his Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of Defense Austin, who spoke about the great victory of the Ukrainians in the Battle of Kiev. All of those four are saying there should be no peace treaty with Russia, no agreement, no negotiation, no diplomacy. The war must be won, is what they're now saying. And with arms and money pouring in from the West, why should the Ukrainians stop? The lives lost and disrupted, does that matter to them? Well, apparently not. Now we have quotes from, for example, the National Security and Defense Council Chief Alexei Danilov. And what he said is, quote, "We can only sign with Russia an act of its capitulation. The sooner they do it, the better it will be for their country," unquote. This was backed up by an advisor to President Zelensky named Alexei Arestovich. He said, quote, "There will be no peace treaty with Russia," unquote. So clearly, these two at least are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. And this should be noted, is not a sign of patriotism or pride in the nation, but evidence of a delusion and probably a mental disorder. But it's a disorder that's being pumped up by the Western geopoliticians who don't give a damn about Ukraine. Their goal is to destroy Russia's economy, to bring Putin down, and to end the threat of a Russia-China alliance to create a new financial system outside of the control of the West. Now, in feeding this delusion, we see Boris Johnson do a video conference in front of the Ukrainian parliament yesterday. And he's attempting to mimic Churchill. Apparently, the two idols for the British are Churchill and Margaret Thatcher. But here are some of the quotes he said. He told the parliamentarians, "You are living through your finest hour," directly lifting that from Churchill during the bombardment of Britain in World War II. He said, "Your resistance is," quote, "one of the most glorious chapters in military history," unquote. And he said, "I have one message for you today: Ukraine will win." He repeated the lies about the Battle of Kiev, that this shows the Russians were disorganized, they are not as powerful as they think, and the heroic people of Ukraine stood up against them. He announced another package of $376 million of aid, military aid, and he promised to keep the weapons flowing. What he's essentially promising is a new endless war with more casualties and destruction in Ukraine. He referred to this fight as one between Ukrainian democracy and Putin's deranged imperial revanchism, of freedom versus oppression, of right versus wrong, of good versus evil. And in noting this, nowhere did he say anything about the suppression of democratic rights of the opposition in Ukraine, whose papers and television stations have been shut down and their leaders jailed. That's a democracy, huh? Now, meanwhile, one of the countries that's seen as pivotal in the need to turn against Russia is India. Boris Johnson recently traveled there. The Brits have been there. U.S. officials have been there. There are enormous efforts underway to pressure the Indian Prime Minister Modi to drop India's neutral stance and to support the war. So Modi is in Europe this week, and he met yesterday with German Chancellor Scholz. Scholz spoke about the rules-based order, how Russia has violated it, that the Putin should be stopped, there should be support for the Ukrainian people. Then he offered 10 billion euros to India to help transition to a green economy. Now, Modi's response, I'm sure, disappointed Scholz and the German war hawks. He said there should be an immediate ceasefire, dialogue, and diplomacy. He said, quote, "We believe that there will be no winning party in this war," unquote, and that peace is the solution. No winning party in this war. This goes against the language you heard previously from Ukrainians, from Johnson and others. Meanwhile, the European Union just announced its sixth package of sanctions. One holdout seems to be Slovakia. Even though Slovakia is providing arms to Ukraine, they announced that they have no option but to continue accepting Russian oil and gas. So they join Hungary in this and Serbia. Now, on the other side, Scholz announced yesterday the end of imports of Russian coal this summer. And the German Economics Affairs Minister Habeck, lunatic greenie, said that Germany is now preparing for a ban on Russian oil imports. He said, quote, "By doing this, we will be harming ourselves at a high cost for us. This will be a bitter and harsh reality," unquote, "but it's necessary to help Ukraine." So freeze Germans, shut down German industry, create between 1.5 and 2 million unemployed in the auto sector. That's necessary to defend, quote, "Ukrainian democracy." This is why you see we're saying that these are unhinged lunatics. And the Greens, remember the Green Party was initially an anti-war party. Now with Foreign Minister Baerbock, with this lunatic Habeck, the Greens are at the center of the pressure on Scholz to change German policy and stick with the war of the West. Now, Putin and Macron had a 2-hour discussion yesterday, and Macron raised concerns about the continuing war and about the problems, the related problems such as food shortages and scarcity. Now, Putin had a clear response, and this is a response about how to end the war and end the shortages. He said the food shortages are aggravated by sanctions and by problems with global logistics and transportation infrastructure. He said that if you address this, if you stop the sanctions, we can begin to deal with the food shortages. Then he said that European Union countries are ignoring war crimes committed by Ukraine in Donbass. And there are ample reports that the Donbass atrocities that Putin cited as the reason for the initial invasion were continuing and escalating before the invasion. In fact, a top Swiss intelligence operative reported that a week before the first Russians set foot in Ukraine on February 24th, a week before that, the shelling intensified by 30 times from the Ukrainian army into Donetsk and Lugansk. So Putin was reacting preemptively to stop a slaughter of the ethnic Russians living in the Donbass region. But Putin said, why will you not bring that up? Why are you not talking about it? And he concluded, according to the Russian readout of the meeting, by saying the West could help end these crimes by exerting pressure on Kiev and terminating weapon supplies to Ukraine, unquote. Well, he's speaking to the French president, who is one of the French are one of the 4 parties that signed the Minsk Accord, which committed Ukraine to negotiate a peaceful agreement in the Donbass. This was signed in 2015, has been ignored by Ukraine. In fact, not only ignored, but they've escalated their attacks with 14,000 dead, mostly civilians, on the attacks from the Ukraine army into the Donbass region. There's no report from the Élysée on Macron's response to Putin's proposed solutions to the question of food shortages and the ongoing war. Maybe there was a response that we don't know about, but we'll see. Macron spent a great deal of time talking to Putin before this started. He could have done something about it had he said France would veto Ukraine entry into NATO, or that the French will pull out of NATO if they don't listen to what Putin is asking for in terms of security guarantees. But he did nothing of the sort. And so he continues to play a duplicitous role, as was pointed out recently by my colleague and associate Jacques Cheminade, the head of Solidarité et Progrès party in France. Now, meanwhile, from the US, we have this gem from Jen Psaki, the spokesman for Biden. She was asked if this is a proxy war. And she said, no, there's no war between NATO and Russia. The war is between Russia and Ukraine. NATO is not involved. And she said to say that NATO is involved is Russian talking points. NATO is not involved. We've seen NATO arms pouring in. We see NATO ramping up the pressure on the Ukrainians to continue the war. This is the kind of sophistry which will be protected by the new Biden Ministry of Truth. And by sophistry, I mean absolute blatant lying. As an American, I'm embarrassed to see my countrymen continue to accept this kind of dishonest lying coming from the US government, especially at the possible expense of US involvement in a thermonuclear war with Russia. This must stop. And I think it's important that people actually hear what Putin is saying, which has been censored as part of the protection from Russian disinformation. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again tomorrow.